continuación, tenemos la conferencia Innovating Higher Education by Developing Students' Creativity and Critical Thinking, a cargo de nuestro invitado, el doctor Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin. El doctor Stéphan es jefe de división y analista senior de la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económicos OCDE. Actualmente lidera el trabajo de la OCDE sobre digitalización en la educación. En particular, el proyecto sobre datos inteligentes y tecnología digital en la educación, análisis del aprendizaje y más allá. También lidera trabajos en torno a la innovación, disciplina, gestión del cambio, fomentar y evaluar la creatividad y el pensamiento crítico en la educación. Welcome, Stéphan. For us, it's a pleasure to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It's really my pleasure and honor to be invited to participate in these encounters. I had the great pleasure to visit University of Rosario a few years back, and I wish it could be in person, but unfortunately, this is not the case. So I would, of course, like to also acknowledge and the honor to speak with Sergio Pulgrin, Carolina Guzman, Justi, Salem Chalela, and of course, you know, I'm so happy to address all those who contributed to share their innovations. What I'm going to do today is, let me share my screen, is to talk more about less a little bit more on the transformation of pedagogy. So I would say more on the questions related to the shift towards a competency-based education. And so for that, I'm going to talk about a project, an international project that I've been leading, and talk a little bit about what the skills for innovation and digitalization are, what we know about how higher education is doing in this area, and what we can actually do as a community to teach and assess the different skills, and give you a few examples of that, and then let's see where the discussion goes. So I'm focusing a bit, there will be a little bit of digital components, but not so much. It will be the traditional teaching and learning aspect. So let me start by, you know, the skills and education for innovation and digitalization. What are we really talking about? So we started by doing a study, so that's a study of tertiary educated people in employment, graduates, and in 19 European countries, Japan, and a couple of Latin American countries, who were asked, what are the skills that you use the most in your job? What are the most important ones? And here you can see what comes up. You know, they say, I have to use my time efficiently to perform under pressure. That's work productively with others. That's what really my job is all about. But what we wanted to know is what are the skills which actually relate to innovation? And for that, there were two questions which were asked. One was, is your organization in front of innovation, of absorbing innovation? And the second one, do you participate yourself in innovation? So when people said yes to those two questions, we said, okay, these people have a highly innovative job. And so let's compare what it is that is very important in terms of the use of skills when you have this kind of job compared to those who don't have it. And so here you can see what comes up on the slide. What came first was coming with new ideas and solutions, so creativity. So people who were having these highly innovative jobs were 4 times as likely as those who did to say that this is a very important aspect of my job. Second, that came, you can see the willingness to question ideas, critical thinking, presenting in audience, communication, entrepreneurialism, awareness of opportunities, etc. But of course, analytical thinking is important as well, you know, that's part. The other thing you can notice is that all the odds are positive, which means that the people who have these highly innovative jobs are always more likely to use all of the different skills that are on this list than the others. So that's a very important way for 2 reasons. One is, first, we didn't ask people, what do you think are the important skills for innovation? So they were asked, what do you do in your job? And we could only differentiate them based on what type of organization they have, so that we don't have this problem of selection bias. So it is not very surprising that creativity or critical thinking or communication or entrepreneurialism come on top, but it is something which is triangulated rather than just a declaration. So that's an important point. The second one is that there is a kind of this belief that in many of the OECD countries, and obviously Colombia too, there is a kind of move to innovation as an engine of growth and well-being, and therefore, more of the jobs are going to become that way. It's something which is very important for people to develop. In between, there was also the new movement related to digitalization. And with, you remember that before the pandemic, what made a lot of the magazine covers was AI and robots and how they were going to change work and outsource a lot of things. And the big question was, what are we going to do as human beings, as part of? And so in that context, there was also a new focus on the skills which we believe are more difficult to outsource and to automate. And creativity, critical thinking, and some of the skills that you see on top of this list are among those. Now, if you look at different types of employer this time, surveys, this one was an employee survey of tertiary education graduates. Now, if you look at the employer surveys, you have actually the same trend. You can see that complex reasoning here, which actually includes in the definition critical thinking, is on the trend up, whatever the different type of occupation that you have, creativity as well, social and emotional intelligence, and perception. So you have these new types of skills which are trending up and are becoming very important. If you ask CEOs of multinational companies and HR companies, we can see we have the same trend. Critical thinking and analysis and creativity, originality and initiative are among the top 10 skills that they believe will be in demand in all these big companies. And actually they anticipated that it would continue to go up, actually with creativity even overtaking critical thinking. And analytical thinking and innovation are on top, in both. But what is interesting is that if you look at the previous edition before 2018, then creativity was actually not part of this list, So it's really something which is coming up and which is increasingly recognized to be something very important for employability and for the labor market that is coming. Now, it's not the only reason, creativity in particular, we know it's a source of well-being. There is a lot of results of positive psychology showing that, it is something that we, the human beings. And so that's also a reason for actually personal and social well-being. And also you can about critical thinking, how it's becoming important in the world of digitalization, where we have this overflow of information and we have to select, around what is wrong, what is right, how we need to assess a lot of information. And so that's also becoming something which is very important for citizenship, increasingly seen as such by many countries. What is higher education doing on that? So I'm going back to the initial survey I've shown you before, where the same tertiary education graduates that were asked about what they were doing in their jobs were also asked how they rated their higher education program a bit before. And so what did they say? They were asked to rank the top 3 skills that they had. And what they say was coming first was the mastery of my own field. That's really what I've learned most. Analytical thinking, acquiring new knowledge. It's not very surprising. This is what higher education is all about. Now, if I highlight the top critical skills for innovation, you can see that, well, analytical thinking is one of them, but many of them are actually not really ranked among the strong points of higher education programs. And you can see that coming with new ideas and solutions, creativity doesn't fare so well. And actually, even the willingness to question ideas, so critical thinking is also not so great, which is very surprising because, of course, when you speak to anyone in higher education, you know, what everyone says is that this is what we do in higher education. You know, that's what we prepare for our students for. And so that's, we were asked the reverse question about what are the weak points of the higher education program that you have attended. So perhaps not surprisingly, they say, you know, writing, speaking a foreign language, negotiating. And so if I say my highlight, you know, the critical skills for innovation, you can see that communication is really one that they consider to be one both not to total strength and strong weakness. You can see that coming with new ideas and solutions is also the first half of the weak points of the higher education. So it was the second half of the strong ones. The only good news or bad news is about the critical thinking, where actually they don't consider it was a weakness either. So it was not a strong point, but it was not a weakness either. So that it was kind of not very noticeable. It's still surprising, but perhaps, you know, we have to think about whether the glass is half empty or half full. So what is happening in many countries is that basically, you know, we used to think of higher education around faculties and disciplines, and increasingly we're also thinking about how do we actually prepare people to be employable, good citizens, happy people, and, you know, to develop a lot of different types of skills. One way to think about it is that, you know, we education systems in general have to develop 3 different types of skills. The technical skills, you know, the knowledge, content knowledge and procedural knowledge, the know what and the know-how, which is basically what we tend to assess. You know, it's certainly what is the main focus, for example, of PISA, the OECD test for 15-year-olds. Increasingly, there is this recognition that social and emotional skills, you know, such as perseverance, collaboration, communication, are also very important. And we also have a survey on that at the OECD. And finally, the higher order thinking skills, creativity, critical thinking, curiosity, etc., metacognition are also a set that needs to be developed. So that's really part of the holistic education, which is increasingly becoming the emphasis of primary and secondary education, but also of higher education. Some important points about them is that they overlap. So you can see that, in fact, you cannot really become good in knowledge acquisition if you are not perseverant, for example. You know, if you're not persistent, you cannot manage. So you need to have, you cannot actually become great in creativity or in critical thinking if you know nothing about your field. You know, so you need also to have the knowledge to do that. But important point is that they are different, and therefore you have to be intentional to develop them. You cannot just assess one and believe that, let's say, because someone is good or performing well in science, that means that it's someone who is good at communicating about science, for example, or that it is someone that is a creative scientist or has a lot of critical thinking. And that we have some evidence about that. So one of the big difficulties, second thing to note is that those things are domain specific. And actually, that also means that they have to be developed in each of the different domains. So that means that it's really something which is for all the different university programs that we have in universities or that we have in education in general. What we mean when we say that those are transversal skills is that probably if we acquire them in science, in language, in history, etc., then when we start learning something new, then we will be a better place to also pick them up in a much quicker way. So how do we do that? The big question actually in many countries is not so much that it's a reluctance to do it. I rarely meet people who say that we shouldn't actually do that. And if you look at a lot of the declaration of the universities or a lot of the declaration of the education system, they all say that, oh, this is important. We want people who are critical thinkers, who are creative, good communicators, who feel well, etc. But the question is, what does it mean in practice for faculty members, for teachers, for instructors? And so what do we need to change to actually make it a reality? What does it really look like? So to do that, we have actually worked on a project with a few institutions on how to articulate an international language. So what does it actually mean in an educational setting? How does it look like? And so for that, we have developed a bank of pedagogical as well. How do we support teachers and faculty members to do that? And so what types of professional learning opportunity they should be given to reach that point? And then finally, we're also developing evaluation instruments. We at the OECD like to tell people all the time, evaluate and measure what you're doing. And so let's, what we've said, okay, let's do it. Let's see actually, let's develop tools that can support institutions to evaluate whether they are going in the right direction or that can support education system to also do that. For that, we've actually already worked and more or less completed the first phase of this project in primary and secondary education. So we had 2 rounds of field work and in 11 countries, and that was a massive endeavor. And we are currently working with 26 higher education institutions from 14 countries. And we have already actually implemented some of these methods over 2 academic years, and we are starting the last academic year of actual field work with faculty members, etc. And you can see here again, we have a lot of different countries. And Mexico only in Latin America, but Spain in Ibero. So that there will be a few resources available for that. So what does it mean to build a professional representation? And for that, we've used actually pedagogical resources. So how do we know what we mean and how do we make it visible? So the first is basically, very academic and looking at the research literature. What do we know about creativity? So in fact, the good thing is that unless you're a real expert in the topic, there is some kind of consensus about what we mean with creativity. And basically, even so you have a lot of different definitions, they all have the same traits, it's the ability to produce work which is novel on the one hand and appropriate, meaning that appropriate is important because it's not like anything goes, it's not anything that is new is creative. It has also to meet certain problems, come out of a certain system. And so in terms of processes, it's very much around divergent thinking, convergent thinking, you can call it exploratory or integrative. In terms of attitude, being open to unusual things, play with that. But what's very important, especially in an education setting, is that it's not about being gifted. It's not about being genius, because it's exactly like it is for knowledge. Some people are more or less knowledgeable, more or less good at their procedural knowledge, and creativity, critical thinking. So it's something that is a skill which can be developed. And people will be at different levels of acquisition efficiency of the different skills. And that's why it is a skill, and that's why it actually means something in an education setting. Critical thinking is the same. It involves similar processes, but of course the objective is very different. When you do critical thinking, the point is not to be novel. Actually, the most conventional solution may be the right one, and so it's more the ability to step back, suspend your judgment, and carefully evaluate what is actually in front of you, so that you reach, at the end of the day, a competent and independent decision. So it has 2 different aspects. One is, I would say, thinking, and it's just about good thinking, and justifying your arguments, weighing different arguments, theories, etc., understanding what they mean. But the other part is the critique and the critical part of it. That's the tougher part, that's the one that people don't want to do most of the time, but it's a very important one. So it's thinking rationally in some ways, slow thinking, but it is also being in a certain understanding the limitations of theories, being able to challenge assumptions, and also to consider different types of theories as well. So what we've done to do that, we needed to translate these in such a way that would actually allow faculty members to see what we are really talking about. For that, we've developed professional development opportunities for those participating with us, but we have also developed a set of resources for them: rubrics, examples of courses, assessments, and examples of student work to actually showcase what it looks like to do that. So the rubrics actually are really meant to develop pedagogical activities or courses, to improve those activities or assess, and also to understand, and talk about these different aspects. We have developed a series, a portfolio of rubrics. So here you can see the one that we use, but the idea is really how you go from complex concepts like creativity and critical thinking to something which is actually applicable to how faculty members develop their courses, what are the things that they should be observing with their students, and how they can actually make this a reality while they are teaching whatever they're teaching, medicine, philosophy, environment, science, whatever. And so the idea is to have something very simple: inquiring, imagining, doing, and reflecting, 4 simple words to remember, and some descriptors of that. We have developed actually a series of a portfolio. We have a more comprehensive version of it because people felt that, the previous one was too simple. So some people like one more than the other. And we have actually a series of those rubrics that work in different domains: music, mathematics, language art, etc. So that's how do we use them. So one is actually to know what you're going to see, what you want to see, and what are the skills that you want your students to develop. Let's take a few examples. So here, that's one example that was done by one of the universities participating in our program. So they had a course on animal welfare and society. So that, and here I'm just focusing on one of the units. And so what they wanted to do as part of this course, so here that's 1 week, it's a 12-week course, 1 semester. And basically, they wanted to practice some application of the animal welfare assessment framework. So, there are different ways of thinking about what is the welfare of animals. And so they wanted to learn that, apply the knowledge, evaluate what was actually existing and how these things are actually being applied. And so here you can see what we ask them to do is to say, what is it that you want? What is the knowledge and the processual knowledge that you want your students to learn? But at the same time, if you're emphasizing critical thinking or creativity, what are the sub-elements of creativity and critical thinking you actually want your students to develop as part of this particular course unit? And so here, if we look at one, we have, that's an example where they do actually a trip to a zoo. So hopefully it will come back once the pandemic is over a bit everywhere. But, there is a first phase where students have to prepare, they want to work on meerkats. And so they have to learn about the animals. They have to remind themselves of the different welfare assessment framework that they have, and think of all the different indicators and on what it can be based: stress, pain, suffering, etc., positive welfare states. Then they work as groups. They take one of those different assessment frameworks that they have, and they actually asked to develop a new one. They have to come up with a new set of indicators that is appropriate to develop the welfare of the animal that they are studying. And they have to think of new ways of doing that is different from the one that they have already studied. Then they come up, they discuss what they've been doing, they apply it to the welfare in the zoo, and then they actually discuss novelty and the limitations of the one that they have developed themselves and the one that exists based on these different things. So that's one example of how this can be done and what that is actually being done somewhere. So it's not me making it up. But that gives you an idea of how that's something which is where, in that particular case, you do both creativity and critical thinking. So what we ask people to do is to use the rubrics to map the different steps of their courses towards against the rubric. So here that's for one lesson. You can see, basically I would say step one, I try to make the inquirer, and this one, they do something, they do the doing, etc. So that you can actually be more intentional in when you are trying to develop these skills or not. Of course, one other important aspect is the assessment. And so what are the types of exams, assessment that you give to your students? So here, that's an example of assignment, assessment task, where people are asked to create an original exhibition. So they have a theme, concept, a theory, etc., and they say that you have to actually design an exhibition that will help people to see what it is that you're talking about. So you can do it physically in a digital space, which means that you have to concentrate on what you think is the most important. You have to choose a way to actually do it and to present these things. So you have to understand what you're talking about, create a concept note, choose a lot of these different things, and then actually present and justify your choices in relation to possible alternatives. So this one is more related to a creative task, where you have to play with different ideas, you have to make connections, you have to think of how you're going to relate to people, you have to do something, and you have to reflect on why you've been doing all these different things. But at the same time, you have to actually exercise a critical thinking as well, so that you can actually understand how to present all these different things, what to show, because it's an exhibition, you don't have time to present everything or whatever. So you have to actually distill these things in an economical way, in many ways. So we can have a lot of different possible tasks. So that's just one possibility. But for that, we have also developed scoring rubrics or assessment rubrics on how we can actually assess a task. So either the product role for that, so that's this one is for creativity, but we have one on critical thinking. It's really how you assess just the essay or the presentation or the performance that a student or a group of students is making, or the process, if you can actually observe the whole process, the whole learning process, or for example, you ask students to have portfolios, etc. We have them actually in a nicer graphic version, and we have actually some of them in Spanish. You can find them on our website. Rubrics are something which is very common in English-speaking countries, not so much in other countries, to my knowledge at least. And of course, one of the difficulties is that they can be very overwhelming for faculty members. That makes a lot of different things to assess. And so what's important is that actually you need to design your own rubric based on the assignment that you're giving. And it cannot just be on critical thinking or on creativity. You have to also assess the knowledge. And so you have to, but what's important when you do it is that you make the criteria for assessment transparent and that you do assess them. Because if you don't assess them, then people are not going to pay attention to them. They need to get feedback. You can actually use them as a way to score, to give them marks if necessary, but then you can engage in a discussion with them to actually make it an important element of the course. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go fast on that, that another way that some institutions increasingly have used is to have specific courses based on innovation, for example. So design thinking is probably one of the most famous methods for that, and where you actually develop specific workshops for some of the university students to develop and go more in depth into the different techniques that you can actually put in place to develop all these different skills. An example is what they've done at Tokyo University, at the University of Tokyo, the high school, where it's a non-degree program where people are selected so that there is a lot of diversity, and what basically students are taught is really to develop an innovation workshop, and so understand in depth some of the aspects of innovation as an art, as it is developed by this particular technique. And so you have to cooperate, that's the main elements, identify solving some social problem, and actually focus on some of the different aspects. One example is here, for example, they had this question about parent-child communication when there is little time, and they came up with this slide in the kitchen that would allow the children to play right after. So that anecdotal, but just to say that this is something that can be done, that can actually lead to interesting results, etc. Another way is to actually develop specific courses for critical thinking, and that's also something that is happening in more and more universities. One of them is the National University of Singapore, as you know, one of the best universities. They've just introduced a new general education module for all their undergraduate students. They had one before, which also included some elements of that, where you have actually critical thinking as one part of this key aspect, and actually some aspects of creativity as well. You can see critique and expression is about that, data literacy is a lot around that, digital literacy as well. And of course, the connections is very much related to creativity and to some extent to critical thinking. What they do mainly in this course is to talk about different types of theories, evaluating different ways of assessing different proofs, working on cognition, things like the work of Kahneman and on slow thinking and fast thinking, etc. So let me conclude and to say actually why also this matters. So one thing that we found is that often the rubrics alone are not enough, and so what's very important for people is really to provide things that are engaging, that are really professional. So in a lot of the higher education, I would say that it is mainly the case in professional programs where people are actually asked to do things that they're going to do when they're going to work. But in many other places, it is not actually done like that, perhaps because the assumption of many of the faculty members is that they're training future researchers. Even so, we know that this is not the case. And, in most of the time, very few of students will actually do a PhD and become an academic or engage in academic research themselves. Be challenging. We found that this is one of the things which is sometimes problematic. If the problem is too simple, people don't get engaged. And of course, if it's too difficult, they don't get engaged either. So finding the right balance is a very important one. Being sure that the technical knowledge, the content knowledge is not downplayed is essential. So otherwise, it becomes courses of philosophy, on critical thinking and creativity. So you have to make sure that it's really integrated into the domains in many cases. And in fact, if you think of the generic methods I've signaled, like design thinking, usually they say that they are domain general, but the truth is that they are usually engineering problems, so that they are in fact domain specific in their own way in most of the cases. Finally, including the development of a product, something which is actually authentic and real, is something which is very important. So education is not just about having a degree or having a good mark, etc., but it's actually really about doing something, and we have to remind ourselves that just taking tests and assessments is not enough, as part of a way to signal that. Finally, we have another set, the final set of criteria, which is actually more challenging for faculty in many cases, and it's actually to leave more student agency, let the students co-design part of the problems, and also, of course, to use specific tasks that allow to look at different things from different perspectives. So that's challenging because you need to find those tasks when you're a faculty member. And once you let your students co-design some of the problem or the solution to the problem, then you're actually in this difficult position where you don't know where it's going to end. They may well come up with ideas that you had not anticipated, where you don't have a solution. And so but that's life, you know, so you have to leave room for these unexpected. So prepare a lot, structure very much what you're going to do, but when it starts, let go and actually allow things to unfold in direction that were actually unexpected, at least some of the time, you know, that's not. And finally, very important, and that we found is always something which is difficult, and I guess it's difficult for all of us, even in our professional life, is really to step back, reflect on what we're doing, and before going to the next, and, you know, giving feedback, receiving feedback, and that's a very important aspect of the learning process. My final remarks are more for institutional leaders and for policymakers. One thing that we find is so important is to be really explicit in what you're trying to achieve and to define what you're talking about, you know, so that's a very important aspect. Then there needs to be alignment and incentives, you know, about all the different levels of education. This is why we have been working in primary, secondary, and tertiary education to think of how can we actually align the whole system. So if you say, I want creative students, you know, to arrive, but in fact, in your admission process, there is nothing that encourages this kind of education before people reach higher education, then it's not going to happen. You know, that's the signal that higher education institutions are sending, is that this doesn't matter, in fact. Very important that it is integrated in the disciplinary teaching in disciplines, because it also needs to be repeated in many occurrences. You know, we don't have time in education. We want to do a lot of things in a short period of time, so it has to be repeated. Students have to learn it over and over and over again and have multiple opportunities to do it. And if you do not assess it, then it's not going to happen. That's for sure. And that's one of the big difficulties with this type of competencies, you know, is that it took us a long time to find ways to assess in a way that we find satisfactory for knowledge, procedures, and content. But we're still struggling with some of the competencies, because we're just starting to do it, and we have to continue actually to really be serious about that. What we've learned is that if you don't have the leadership involved, then it's not going to happen. Very important. You need to provide professional learning opportunities. Part of it comes from scaffolding tools and examples. That's what we're trying to do by building this bank of pedagogical resources, but you also need to provide communities of practice, exactly like what you're doing today as part of these encounters. People have to speak to each other, to learn from what they're doing, to exchange, to have, and to work together on some of those different programs. And of course, you can do it internationally within an institution, domestically, all the different ways, digitally, all these different ways are very important. And last but not least, you know, of course, monitoring and evaluating what you're doing is so important. Not just so much to know whether you have succeeded or failed, you know, but so that you can improve and know what you need to improve, what has worked well, how do you need to tweak things if you want to persist in this direction. So that's a critical element. So my final slide, we are still working on this project at the OECD. We've already published on the previous one in primary and secondary. We are still working on that. One thing that we're going to do very soon is actually to pilot a mobile app where all the resources that we have developed will be brought together in one place. And we want to see how, when we put them in the hands of faculty, teachers, what actually happens. Second thing we are going to start is to work on a standardized assessment of creativity and critical thinking for undergraduate students. And so that would be interesting. So if some institutions we are interested in participating, just let me know. And if you think of any opportunities to collaborate around this agenda, or any forum where we can actually work together to have this big international community of practice, then let's do that, and that would be really terrific. So that's really all about innovation. It's us doing it, and we have a lot of different ways to do that. And so thank you so much, and let's have a fruitful discussion around this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Stefan. That was a fantastic conference. We do have a number of questions, so let's see. Ahora vamos a dar paso a unas preguntas del
Now we will
auditorio.
have some questions by the audience.
La primera es, ¿cuál
first one is,
considera
Which do
que
you
son las
consider
principales,
that are the
los
main
principales retos futuros para la
challenges in the
educación
future
superior
for
en
the
una
higher
región como
education in a
Latinoamérica?
region like Latin America?
I think that, so shall I answer one by one or? Okay.
Yes,
So
perfect.
Okay. So I think that one of the main challenge, like it's not just in Latin America, but everywhere, you know, it's really hard to improve the quality of teaching and learning in higher education institutions and make it actually really more adapted to the new needs of, you know, what's coming in the economies. And so that's a very big challenge everywhere.
Ok. La segunda es, ¿cuáles son los aportes de la pedagogías de Latinoamérica al desarrollo del pensamiento crítico?
No, I didn't. Sorry, because my interpretation was off. Sorry about that. Can you repeat, please?
¿Cuáles son los aportes de la pedagogía de Latinoamérica al desarrollo del pensamiento crítico?
Yes. Yeah. So I think that, you know, I mean, you will know, and actually you will know better than me by the end of today, you know, some of those different contributions. But I think that well, perhaps to also get back to the previous question on the challenges for Latin America as I see them, I think that the best universities in Latin America make a lot of great contributions in this area. I would say that in some cases, I can see sometimes more of the traditional way of teaching and learning, but I can see a lot of innovations everywhere. And, you know, so there is a very high quality of programs. So, you know, when I visit, I can always see these Fab Labs, these design thinking approaches, you know, it's project-based learning happening in many of the institutions. And actually, Rosario was one of those institutions where I could see a lot of good things happening. However, let me say that I also know that there is a big variety across, there is really a big variety across institutions in Latin America. And I think that perhaps one contribution I would like to see is how some of this great teaching and learning that is happening in some of the institutions trickle down so that it's become more systemic, and it's something that we see everywhere, you know, across the system.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias al Dr. Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin por su conferencia. So, well, thank you. You really appreciate you taking time here.